We're going to go over the purchase agreement, which can be found in Student Corner's form. Just go to Strather Academy, go all the way to the bottom, the downloadable forms, hit that, and you go straight to the purchase agreement. That's where we can get it. So let's bring it up and take a look at it. This purchase agreement is not an ordinary purchase agreement. It is similar to the purchase agreement that we use for multi-list, but there are some changes on it. I converted it to a Word document, and I made some small changes, which is very significant. So you want a purchase agreement that's all fixed and ready, where all you have to do is just plug in certain numbers, and you don't have to spend hours and hours working with it. Because of this, there's only 4 or 5 changes I have to make in the purchase agreement, and it's ready to go. So if you're looking at the agreement right now on the screen, you'll see the first thing is the address. I got to put in an address. And right now, I took the address out for the purposes of protecting the buyer in this case. And then, of course, we got to put in a sales price. And in this case, the sales price is $58,000, consistent with our pro forma. Now, if you notice here, there are 4 options to consummate a sale. One is a cash sale. And oftentimes, even if you're getting financing, you may want to use a cash sale because a mortgage is a cash sale eventually. Now, the mortgage have a contingency clause, which is paragraph B, and it says that if the buyer cannot obtain, let's look at it. If a buyer cannot obtain a firm commitment for such mortgage within 40 business days from the date of seller acceptance, a seller's written option, this offer may be declared null and void and the deposit shall be returned to purchaser forthwith. So you could have a 40-day inspection anyway with a cash sale. You don't absolutely have to have it under a cash sale with a new mortgage. You could just make an inspection period long enough to cover your position. So I'm going to highlight some of these things I think is very important. Now, this is a mortgage assumption or land contract assignment. It's unusual. A lot of lenders right now are simply going with a short sale, and it's not too many land contract assignments, but if you need it in the unlikely event it's there, the sale to an existing mortgage, which is the same thing, it's an assumption of the mortgage, but the sale with the seller-held mortgage or a land contract. I like seller-held mortgages better than land contracts because you can use them for comps, and you really cannot use for comps land contracts as much because it is between the buyer and the seller, and the appraisers don't pick that up. There are certain words that they use with registered deeds that the appraisers pick up. One is WD, warranty deed, QCD, quick claim deed, MTG, mortgage. Those are picked up, and this is computer driven. So one of the things you may want to do if you're selling properties and you want to protect the comps is that you would simply form your LLC, a little mortgage company, and put things in the mortgage company. Now, you have to comply with the state regs on Dodd-Frank and get licensed, but that is not a long process to do. Just contact Laura at the state of Michigan or wherever state that you may be in. It should be a requirement. Just check and make sure that you're in compliance. You can do 1 or 2 a year, I believe, but if you do 3 deals, then you trigger that compliance to get licensed. There's also mortgage companies or people who are licensed. As long as they originated for you, you're fine. Once they originated, then you can service it yourself. And that's what we do. We have an originator in many cases. Okay, so in this case, the property is subject to, there's no tenants, there's none. The brokers hereby to make this offering a deposit of $1. That's a small amount. Now, it could be more. In this case, it was $1. They brought the juice in the form of cash, cashier check, certified check, or promissory note. Now, that is really something. If I made this $1,000, which is more typical, and the check or promissory note, that would be great. Now, I don't think this promissory note should be underlined because it draws attention. Otherwise, people think it's just normally par for course. I'm just going to highlight it so you understand some of the creative stuff. Now, FHA and VA properties got appraised. In this case, it has to appraise for $58,000. I don't know why it said 82, 58,000. Should be that number. Additional offers, there'll be no additional offers. The seller has, you got to have the seller's closure as far as condition of the property, lead-based paint and the like. You got to disclose with the broker, are you representing the buyer and the seller or dual agency? And here's what's very important. As evidence of title, seller agreed to furnish purchaser at the time of closing a commitment for title insurance. Now, a commitment, what is title insurance? It is insurance to ensure the title is good title. If there's something that's been unrecorded, there's a challenge, the title company would have to settle all of that so that you have good, clean title at the end of the day. And you should always get title insurance because they will go back and see whether the property taxes are paid, the water bill is paid, are there additional liens. You may research the property, but you may miss something. Title companies are experienced and you need to use them. Please always say, I will always use a title company. Good, glad to hear you say that. Okay, if the offer is accepted by the seller and the title can be conveyed, the purchaser agreed to complete the sale within 10 days after issue of the commitment for title insurance. However, if the seller is in accordance with paragraph B or D, which is getting a mortgage, the closing will be as soon as the mortgage application approved and the closing date can be obtained from the lender. The location shall be determined by the selling broker. But look what it says in terms of getting the mortgage. The mortgage we have here is that we're giving ourselves a full 40 business days. 40 business days is how much time? That's 8 weeks. That's 8 weeks, everyone. That's 2 months to get the mortgage. And there's a very good reason we're going to do that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, so you have 8 weeks to get the mortgage. And just to make sure we're okay here, I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to highlight this so that we can connect the dots. Okay, now if there's a problem, objection to the title, you got 30 days to fix it. Or at the buyer's option, it can be unraveled. That's not the seller's option, it's the buyer, because the seller may have a problem and want to change his mind, and the buyer say, hold it, I'm going to take it and straighten it out myself. Now, here's one of the most important things. It's the default clause. If in the event of default by purchaser, the seller shall, at his sole option, declare a forfeiture and retain deposit as liquidated damages. That's it. That's all. You cannot have it reinforced, the terms reinforced from the buyer's end. That's all the seller can do to the buyer. But in the event of default by the seller, the purchaser may, at his option, look at this, elect to enforce the terms and or demand and be entitled to immediate refund of their entire deposit and full termination of the agreement. So the buyer can elect to enforce the terms, but the seller cannot. Of course, how about if the buyer cannot enforce the terms? That means the seller could get a better offer and cancel and walk. It would be the stupidest thing in the world for the buyer to let the seller off and walk. And it would also be the stupidest thing in the world for the buyer to obligate themselves to liability if they should default somehow. In other words, the buyer may suffer a tragedy and cannot close. So they say you defaulted, you got to prove you didn't close. You may change your mind, but you're still obligated to close. Well, you walk away and you lose your deposit. That's what happens. And the reason that is important is that the seller may have been using that money, the anticipated money from closing to buy another deal they were going to make 50 grand on. Once you default, you hurt the seller, he don't get the money, he can't make the 50 grand. Guess how much money he could sue you for? Would you guess it's the amount of your deposit, or would you guess it's the 50 grand? You guessed right, it's the $50,000. In other words, the seller can now sue you for $50,000 on a deal to which you only had a $1,000 deposit on, or even in this case, initially a $1 deposit. The seller can sue you. Unlimited liability, so always protect yourself. And if you learn nothing else, remember that. Now, one of the things you always want to do is to limit the amount that the buyer have, build it into the financing package. And the clever purchase agreement takes the prorations out. Paragraph 13 says all the taxes and assessments, which is a lien upon the land, have to be paid. It says the current taxes shall be paid but not prorated. Will you look at that? Now, once again, I don't think it's a good idea to put these things, anything to draw attention to anyone, but the FHA will allow up to 6% of the closing costs towards closing costs. If the closing cost is 4.5%, theoretically that's all they're going to allow, the 4.5%. You cannot get 6% if you don't have 6% for closing costs. But if you have more than 6%, all you can get is 6%. The biggest part of the closing cost is property taxes. So if the seller have to pay the property taxes and you don't have to prorate them, that's a huge, huge step towards lowering your closing costs, and it assures that the 6% will cover it. Now, if you close this deal on June the 28th, it's not much advantage because the taxes are due July 1st. So that means that you would only get 2 days worth of prorations. If you waited 3 days later and closed it July 1st, they would have to pay the entire property taxes, at least for the first half. And then you would get at least 6 months. Now, if you close this deal, say September the 5th, and the taxes had not been paid yet, the seller would be obligated at that point to pay the taxes all the way through June the 30th, and you would get a full credit. The reason is that the taxes are delinquent now, so they have to pay all taxes. They cannot pay a half year. They don't have that option to pay a half year in September. The only option they have is to pay it up through June the 30th in order to get it out of delinquent status. If they paid it up through the first half, then the second half would be deemed delinquent because they passed the period of time that they could pay the taxes half and half. So that's the timing of closing is critical in a purchase agreement. What month are you closing this? Okay, so the next paragraph is not that important. The buyer can get you some insurance and stuff and collect the fee. Now, paragraph 25 is important. Paragraph 15 said by the execution agreement, the purchaser acknowledged subject to 25, they're going to take the property as is, and the brokers do not warrant anything. But this is kind of disingenuous a little bit. They're going to take it as is, but they want certain conditions. Okay. Now, paragraph 16, the seller gives the buyer the magic 6%. Here's something. Let's highlight that. Okay, so let's go again. Number 17, if there's a balloon due, in many cases there are balloons, they do not want it to affect their broker. Hold the broker harmless. Timing is paragraph 18 is time is of the essence. 19 is legal document with a lawyer. 20, this agreement supersedes any other agreements. In other words, you may have had agreement, now this one comes along. The other ones are dead. This supersedes. You can't have 3 or 4 agreements out there if something supersedes. So this states that if you sign and just re-sign, you should terminate the one first and then sign the new one, if it's say between 2 parties. If 2 or more persons execute this as joint and separate, the risk of loss, if there is a loss, is required that the seller is going to do the purchase has the option to cancel agreement and deposit shall be refunded to the purchaser. The purchaser to proceed with the closing, and at his at their sole discretion either require that the seller repair the damage before the closing or deduct the purchase price a fair and reasonable estimate of the cost of repairing the property. That all have to be done before the closing. After the closing, it's a bit late. The seller has an obligation to look at the property before the closing. There's no seller acknowledges there's no representation, promises, guarantees, or warranties of any kind. The broker certainly do not want to be liable for anything. This deal, the paragraph 24 deals with how long before the property before the purchase agreement is canceled. So you got 5 days, it's irrevocable for 5 days.
Paragraph 25 is probably the most important paragraph. It states that the purchaser do or do not want to choose to have the property inspected. If you choose that you want to have the property inspected, which is necessary if you're going to do a little creative financing, typically how the deal is presented is that the seller is presented, we're going to get into the deal, but a property is the full price that you desire to buy the property plus, well, let's say the full price that you desire to buy the property for, which includes credits back to you. There's a couple of things. One, you want to stabilize the community, so there's an effort to push the prices up as far as possible. If the appraisal come in low, then so be it. You just take a credit and keep the price the same so we can help stabilize our community. Because the banks, FHA, they've been really hard selling properties very, very cheap, pushing values down. And we've got to fight back, if you will. We got to fight back in the sense that we want to buy the property and sell the property for the full value of the purchase price plus the fix-up, If you bought something for $50,000, need $15 grand in fix-up, your total cost is $65. But yet if you record a deed for $50, you see what you just did, you pushed the values down. So make it $65. Now if it came back for $60, still make it $65. Just take a $5,000 credit. In other words, keep the price the same, and the seller just give you the difference as a credit so that the seller is not hit. You do not lower your price. The community is not hit. The price is the same. Paragraph 25 is an important paragraph. And let me read it. Seller shall permit an inspector or purchaser choosing to have access to the property for the purpose of inspecting and reporting upon the physical condition of the property, including structural, plumbing, heating, and electrical systems, air quality, and verification of square footage, period. Now that language is different than the standard language because it didn't provide for all of these items to look at. It more or less provided for the verification of square footage, but this is typically found if you're looking at an apartment building. It's typically not done for a house because you look at it and it's your housing inspector and that's it. But we're saying that all of these things got to be looked at, and the inspection shall be concluded within 30 business days after acceptance of this offer. Now that could be 30 business days or it could be 50 business days. Theoretically, it should be concluded, you should allow for enough time for you to get a mortgage. And after you get the mortgage, any negotiations that you're going to do with the seller, as far as credits and stuff, should be concluded in writing. You theoretically cannot put it in writing before. The reason you cannot put it in writing before is very, very simple. You have to disclose it to the mortgage company. We're not here to create any fraudulent transactions because when you make application, they want to have all of your agreements. If you have an agreement that you're withholding, then that could be criminal. And you do not want to withhold anything. Now, if you made a verbal agreement with the seller that they're going to give you 10 grand, depending upon what the appraisal come back and all of that, because the seller going to want their net. If they say, look, I want 50,000 net, well, how about if the appraisal came back for 50? You get nothing, theoretically. So you may have a handshake with the seller to give you back X number of dollars, but it's subject to the appraisal, it's also subject to you doing your inspection, saying how much you need. The whole thing is subject. But after you got the mortgage approved, you know all of those answers. So you can now go back and tighten it up. It may not be the amount you negotiated for, it may be a amount less, or it may be the exact amount. Although the appraisal didn't come back, you're not going to get the money. You just take a credit to protect the comps in the community. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Although your price may be the same, you may not get the amount of money because the appraisal did not come back. And the lender is only going to loan based upon the appraisal. But you want to take and you have a handshake with the seller. Now, that is not enforceable. If the seller changes their mind, too bad. That's why you don't have to disclose it because the Michigan statute of fraud says it has to be disclosed. It has to be in writing. A handshake agreement, you give me 5 grand back, is not an agreement that is enforceable. And the seller, of course, can change their mind. They say, I changed my mind. The deal is over. So you leave yourself an opening. If he changes his mind, you change your mind, you can walk. Or you negotiate after the mortgage is approved. Once the mortgage is approved, you sit back down to the seller and revisit it, and you will make an addendum at that point. Usually, the responsibility is on the seller to do the repairs that you want, these extra repairs. Now, the seller can, in fact, is going to give it to a contractor, and maybe that contractor is one that you choose. If they do choose it, and he give it to your contractor, he's going to have you sign off and release him from any obligation to give you any improvement dollars as agreed. And he's probably going to put your name on the check. And we could talk about the check, but I think maybe we could even combine these ideas right now, kind of a shortcut to our remaining items, because we're just about ready to wrap up things. The seller can give you, the title company can give the seller 2 checks totaling the amount. That's one thing. Or the seller can pay for the closing completely separate. The seller can pay for the closing statement. The seller can pay for the repairs pursuant to the purchase agreement completely separate. And you would essentially, the seller would write a check after the closing. But you could work these details out with the seller. But one thing for sure, it's not going to go on the HUD-1 that the seller gave the buyer X number of dollars. If it's a very small amount, that's one thing. If it's substantial, the answer is no. If it's the seller's responsibility, then let the seller work it out. You just give the seller the contractor, and perhaps that'll work. So the balance of this says, the inspection shall be concluded within 30 business days after acceptance of the offer. If the inspection includes any defects or needing improvements in the property which result in the buyer having cause to be dissatisfied with the condition of the property, they shall notify the seller in writing. The seller shall satisfy their concerns, or the buyer may, at their option, cancel this transaction and receive their deposit back in full termination. Failure of purchaser to notify seller of such defects needed or repairs or improvements within 3 days after said inspection period ends shall deem the purchaser satisfied, and this purchase shall go forth in the as-is condition. Notwithstanding anything to the contrary, seller agrees to replace the furnace and hot water tank and any other reasonable request. That's pretty cool. In this case, the seller has agreed to replace the hot water, the tank, and any other reasonable request. That leaves way for a $6,400 credit to the buyer. Okay, so this pretty much wraps up the purchase agreement. There's an arbitration clause. There's a clause that you can use faxes. There's a clause you should get a lawyer, and then it's your signature. So that is it with the purchase agreement. Now, purchase agreement is a legal binding document, and you could very well get a lawyer, or you could always call us on the purchase agreements. As brokers, agents, we are experienced, and we would be happy to help any of our students to draft a proper purchase agreement. As a matter of fact, we insist, if you're going to do a purchase agreement and you're one of our students, we want to make sure you do the agreement right. So don't try it home alone. Call up your coach. Call us right over here at 313-444-9691. Or go to the student corner, go to the chat room, send me a direct email, hstrather@gmail. Let us make sure that these agreements are properly structured. We do not want you to get hung up in agreement that you did it out of control and we have problems. So I thank you so very much for listening to me. We have this one little other item we're going to visit, and we're going to wrap things up. I'll be back with you in a few minutes.